Hello everyone, I'm Rania Khalek and this is Dispatches. Africa is under threat. A foreign power is colonizing it, exploiting it, and forcing it into debt. Is it the West that's been draining Africa of its resources and blood, occupying it, installing and overthrowing its governments, and sustaining its wealth with Africa's treasures? Nope, apparently it's China. At least that's what Western governments, along with their loyal media and think tanks, want us to believe. To understand what's really happening and to get to the bottom of all these accusations against China and Africa, I'm joined by two excellent guests. Mikaela Nhondo Erskog is an educator and researcher with Pan Africanism Today, which works with organizations like the National Union of Metalworkers of South Africa. She's also a researcher at the Tricontinental Institute, and she's on the organizing committee of No Cold War. And we also have Kambale Musavuli, an activist, writer, and analyst with the Center for Research on the Congo, Kinshasa. So Kambale and Mika, welcome.
Thank you for having us.
So before I get started, I guess I just kind of want to say, for our mostly Western audience who's watching, I guess just to convey the enormity and importance of Africa as a continent. Africa is the second largest landmass. It has a combined population of 1.34 billion people spread across 55 countries. And as we know, it's rich in many, many, many resources, plagued with the resource curse. And, before we get into the issue of China and Africa, I just feel like it's very important to note that the U.S. does have 29 military facilities that we know of in at least 15 African countries. And then there's, of course, France, which has bases in at least 10 of them. And so it's just funny to mention all this because we're going to be talking about how the Western media is constantly warning that it's Chinese imperialism that's this big threat to the African continent. And I feel like a good way to get started with this conversation is to maybe define some of these terms that China is constantly accused of, right? We constantly hear, China is practicing neoliberalism in Africa. It's neocolonialism. It's this debt trap diplomacy. It's imperialism. So, maybe we can start with you, Kambale. When you think of the word imperialism in terms of Africa, what does that mean? And then we can talk about who's actually doing it.
For me, it's very direct. Congo is a country that was colonized by Belgium. It's been under its control since 1885. What I'm saying, under control of Belgium, to King Leopold II, who received the Congo as his own personal property after the so-called Berlin Conference. It's quite fascinating for us as Congolese that we know the only reason King Leopold had control of this land is because of the United States. President Grover Cleveland was the president who, through his officials, was the first country, the United States was the first country to recognize Congo as the personal property for Leopold. We look at imperialism, also colonialism from 1908 to 1960, where Belgium received the Congo officially after King Leopold to control the land. What was happening during the time was the extraction of copper that was needed during World War I and World War II, especially for the rebuilding of Europe. We also know the extraction of uranium in DRC under Belgian rule, and the uranium that was extracted for the so-called Manhattan Project with Einstein as one of the scientists. That uranium extracted, taken to Auckland. That uranium was actually taken from Congo to Auckland and found its way in Japan when we had Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombed by the United States, right? And then beyond that, after 1960, as our democratically elected Prime Minister Lumumba was assassinated with the help of the CIA, we saw the continuous support of the United States to regimes in DRC, from Mobutu to Kabila and to present. So when we think about imperialism in DRC, we see the United States, we see the continuous support of oppressive regimes in the DRC for the past 100 years. Now, the context of mentioning China, for me, I think is problematic because people throw terms that don't make sense unless they don't realize what colonialism means, right? They don't understand. And I've even heard people say that China is enslaving Africans. I mean, for anyone who has studied slavery, who understand what classical colonialism, China's engagement in Africa is not taking millions of people through the Atlantic Ocean, many of whom, millions died through that process, forced to work for free for 400 years in plantations in the Americas. That's not what is happening. And I think it's a misnomer. It's best to dispel this myth, to speak about fact. What is actually China is doing, rather than using these fancy media propaganda term to describe what China is doing in Africa.
And I guess, Mika,
can I add something?
Yeah, of course. I would put the same similar question to you and add anything you'd like to what Kambale said, please.
No, I completely agree with Kambale. And I would only add the fact that, again, when we're talking about classic colonialism, not only does it involve this kind of coercive labor component, but it involves this kind of form of territorial and political annexation, this by force, right? By military means, by economic means. And I mean, I was reading the great text by the Guyanese Marxist Walter Rodney a couple of days ago, or I think it was like a week ago, where he talks about the book is called The Underdevelopment or Europe's Underdevelopment of Africa. And I think this is an important point, which relates to our understanding of China and China's participation on the continent, is that under colonialism, there is an active and willful underdevelopment of the so-called colonies, right? And I love how Walter Rodney describes it, how, through the process of colonialism, European, American, colonial mining forces, just as an example, they extract all that wealth, all the ports, all the infrastructure are directed to the sea to go to Europe. And what is left in Africa? And he says, what is left in Africa is holes. There's like total degradation of human life. And it's important, I think, to mention the underdevelopment, because what we've seen from China and Africa is an advance of so many social and economic infrastructure that is so critical to, just improving minimum standards of living, whether it's railways, whether it's schools, whether it's water pipelines, whether it's energy infrastructure. So the use of colonialism needs to be put appropriately into the context and needs to be understood meaningfully in terms of what it's actually meant in a historical context.
No, I mean, that's excellently said. And, to build off of that, I guess what I would want to ask you, and Mika, you can take this one first, is, in terms of what China is doing, you just kind of, gave a very brief summary of what you perceive China's actions to be, or outcome of China's investment, I guess, in Africa. But how would you characterize what China is doing in Africa? If it's not colonialism, what is it?
So I would say, and I want to give examples of it, but I would say cooperation, participation within a totally different framework, which I think we'll be able to talk about more when we look at the US's military presence on the continent and things like that. But it has a qualitatively different participation and manifestation on the continent. So one is, we need to understand these accusations of colonialism come in the context of China becoming Africa's biggest partner. And I mean, not only economic partner, it's on all fronts: cultural, educational, environmental, right? It was quite recent, I think it was in 2019, the US, formerly Africa's top trading partner and largest source of investment, was actually overtaken by China, right? And this was, I think, between 2013 and 2019 are the stats. And during that time, trade with the US has fallen whilst China has risen. And accompanying all of that, if we go back to 2000, China, through the Forum of China-Africa Cooperation, known as FOCAC, established relationships with almost all African countries and has signed and established various agreements for trade, for education, for infrastructural projects that completely outpaces the US, right? I mean, some of the facts that I think is important to throw out is that China's been building, 6,000 kilometers of railways, 20 ports, 80 large power facilities, and not just any power facilities. They've been pushing more and more for both from the Africa and China side for renewable energies. So, for example, we have hydroelectric power plants coming up, such as in Nigeria, they have one. In Ghana, there's one. We also have huge investment in technological transfers and generally bolstering telecommunications, where we've seen Ethiopia and Kenya hugely benefit from the kind of easy and cheap technology that has been coming from China through, I think it's Techno is one of the big companies, much more affordable than your iPhones, right? Literally, I think it's like $50 for a Techno phone, whilst an iPhone goes around, what is it, $100 plus, right?
1,000,
right?
like at least.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, what am I saying? 100? Sorry, I'm speaking in a different currency, so I'm trying to put it in context. But $50 versus $1,000, yeah. So, and I mean, this has also been accompanied with, I think there are currently at least 60,000 African students who are studying in China. Many of them on Chinese scholarships. We also have had an expansion of what the Belt and Road Initiative, which is this kind of big, not only infrastructural project that China has been leading predominantly in Asia, in the Maghreb and the Sahel, and now on East Africa and Southern Africa. But they've developed these important digitization prospects where we have huge fiber optic cables now connecting Africa not only to China, but to Asia and Europe. So, it kind of goes way beyond just a simple like transactional relationship that we're often misled to believe.
It's so interesting because what you're describing is so much building of infrastructure, which always gets left out of this conversation. But then I'm curious, because we're always hearing this accusation of like these really awful loans and this kind of like debt trap diplomacy. But I guess when I think of that trap diplomacy, I actually think of America. Like I think of structural adjustment programs and this sort of like the fact that when you think of the US, and this is also the case for the Middle East, when you think of the US will not have any sort of financial relationship with a country or investment with a country unless they meet certain conditions, right? Like whether it's privatizing certain industries or basically just being a capitalist country. Like you have to have a capitalist economy for the US to work with you. Whereas with China, it seems as though there are no conditions. Like it doesn't really matter what kind of economic model a country has. That's not what China first bases its investments on. And second, doesn't enforce any sort of political or economic policies onto countries. So, I mean, can you speak a bit to that, Mika? And then I do have a question for Kambale on top of that. But can you speak a little bit to this idea of debt trap diplomacy and who's actually doing the debt trapping, and maybe what do these loans or investment from China actually entail?
Sure. So I mean, debt trap diplomacy was basically going around during Trump's administration, and essentially, it's this idea that is accused against China that they come in with certain predatory like economic agreements that prey on the weak African states, which one I think is incredibly patronizing, that we have a continent of over 1 billion people, very diverse, has some of the greatest like intellectuals of our time, but yet we can somehow be simply duped by this nefarious Chinese other. So one, it's
like double racist, by the way. It's like be careful of those sneaky Chinese.
Sneaky race, like, racism on China, racism on Africa. Exactly. One. Two is that it also like undermines the historical role that the US and various European powers have played in the structural adjustment programs and the historical predatory economic and financial investments that they've placed, as you said, that often tend to be totally conditional. You have to restructure your economy, all of those things. But let me use two things. I want to talk about where this is coming from and one of the examples that is often used to justify this kind of trap. And two is in terms of actually how loans have been treated. So one is the example that keeps going around has been the Sri Lankan port, right? Wait, I have the name down. Hambantota. Sorry, I don't know if that's the correct saying, but Hambantota port.
I'll take it.
Essentially, essentially, so Sri Lanka, for those who don't know, is in Asia. It's in a strategic position for the kind of like Indian Ocean shipping route. So China would kind of pass it on its way to North Africa and then can also access Europe and other parts of the world, right? And essentially, I think it was in 2003, there was a proposal made around building a port there that would, again, give revenue to the country. Remember, at the time, Sri Lanka, since 1983, had been, embroiled in a civil war that only ended in 2009. So they're in a very difficult position. But basically, they do kind of feasibility studies. They get actually Canadians and I think it was a Dutch company to do these feasibility studies, which basically show that it is viable within certain constraints. And by 2007, Sri Lanka approaches, actually not China, approaches India and the US, asking, hey, we have this proposal. What do you guys think? But US and India both decline. So then they approach China, and China basically approves or says we can have an offer of like a $300 million loan. It will be 15-year repayment with 4 years of a grace period. And the president at the time of Sri Lanka accepts this. And again, remember, they're ending their civil war in 2009. A global recession is unfolding. There's a lot of political instability within the country, right? And at the time, I think it was by 2015, they were like actually beginning the process, and or the process is unfolding of the like completion of the port. But what happens is that they're struggling to pay all their like national debts, their international bonds, and Sri Lanka chooses, because of the internal dynamics, chooses to privatize the port, and the port goes in the hands of China Merchants, which is a state-owned enterprise from China. And basically, using the revenues from privatizing that port, they're able to pay their debts and service any kind of national issues. So what the US has been saying, which maybe I didn't say that in the beginning, what the US has been saying and punting is that China seized this port and forcefully took it after creating a series of predatory, debt and loan agreements, when in fact there was a lot of historical and internal dynamics that led the Sri Lankan government to choose to privatize that port and let the operations go over to this Chinese company. So that's the example that's often referred to, which is actually incorrect in terms of the facts of what happened. Then two, in terms of loan repayments or loans in general, as you mentioned, China tends to give less conditionalities, much longer time periods for repayment. But the US refuses to acknowledge the fact that the Chinese have a more flexible and long-term understanding of these loans. And the reality is that even during the pandemic and a couple of years before that, China has consistently tried to find, and again, not because China's the benevolent, overseer, but because there's negotiations and they treat Africans, members of the global South countries, as equal participants who are able to pursue their interests and who should be able to push for their interests, right? So, basically, China's canceled debts, deferred debts, restructured debts, according to various contexts, and they do differ, and there is argument on which countries get loans canceled for what reasons. But ultimately, we've seen a history of more favorable terms. And I think China's renegotiated, I think it was or it was in 2019, they deferred and renegotiated 50 billion, I think, of loans.
Yeah.
And countries like Cuba in 2010, struggling under US imposed, sanctions, struggling to get resources in the country, struggling to get financing in the country. They got a debt of $2.8 billion written off in 2010. So, historically, we've seen much more favorable terms from China. And it does come from a theory of, I think they call it patient capital, where it's not about reaping the rewards of tomorrow. It's about building these longer relationships. And in many cases, there are certain investments that they know. I think it's in Pakistan, where they know that like 80% of their investments won't be recovered just based on the conditions that are there. So I think this understanding of, patient capital, of a certain social responsibility is there that isn't at all in the ambit of US and European approaches to aid and investment on the African continent.
Right. It's often left out that, like you mentioned, China actually ends up ultimately losing money, right? And in a lot of these projects. And so, Kambale, I wanted to bring this issue to you because this is recently in the news. And that was this issue of these Chinese companies in the Democratic Republic of Congo in the DRC. Basically, the Chinese companies that are working there were suspended over illegal activities. And the response from China was so interesting. Beijing basically followed up by saying they're going to impose sanctions on these Chinese companies if they're found guilty, which I think is pretty stunning and remarkable, just because I maybe I could be wrong, but I can't think of a case where the US or Europe or Canada did something similar based on illegal activities of their many, many exploitative companies across the African continent. But I guess my question for you is, can you talk a little bit about what happened with that situation? And what is, I guess, the American role in the DRC compared with the Chinese role? How would you compare their actions?
I mean, the announcement, I think most people have they've missed actually what happened. It's very historic for a nation such as China to sanction companies that have been shown to have done something bad. And you kind of mentioned it, right? That we have foreign corporations, Western corporations, with so much documentation from the United Nations report, from OECD complaints from the ground. The reports exist. Curse of Gold, written by, for example, Human Rights Watch, that documented Bonro, who built a house for rebel groups, provided them with private jets, and never been sanctioned till today. You have Barrick. I mean, the companies are there. Actually, we even created a website called Conflict Minerals, where we listed the names of 85 Western companies implicated in the pilfering of Congo's resources. None of them have ever been sanctioned whatsoever. So this sanction on the 6 Chinese companies comes from a documentary that was released by a Cameroonian journalist, Foka, who did a documentary targeting a Chinese mining company, showed what was actually taking place in terms of the illegal exploitation. When the information became public, China took action. So as we see that, the fundamental question will be, is China as a state exploiting the Congo? Because it's taken out of context. You have a private company that is doing illegal operations, have been exposed, and the country takes action to hold them into account. Is that the Chinese state condoning this behavior? That's not the case. But now the question will come to Freeport-McMoRan, the American company that used to have the largest copper reserve. Dan Rather did a report that was actually nominated for an Emmy, that did not win an Emmy, a few years back. They went on the ground, saw Freeport-McMoRan based out of Phoenix, Arizona, where they had the largest copper reserve and cobalt mine. They promised to the community to build houses for them, promised to build a clinic for them, provide water and roads for them. They never did, but this is what they told the investors. And then rather filmed the community. They did not receive what they were promised, and they were displaced. And this is the largest copper reserve owned by a company based out of Phoenix, Arizona. This documentary came out. The report came out. Nothing actually happened. But you know what actually unfolded for the Freeport-McMoRan case? Surprisingly, that the contract that Freeport had for this Tege Fungurume mine was facilitated by a member of the U.S. Embassy in Kinshasa. It's Henderson, right? She was the political attaché at the U.S. Embassy. So it's in this Dan Rather report, right? Then, after she left the U.S. Embassy, you know who she became? She is currently the vice president of Freeport-McMoRan. From the U.S. Embassy to now the vice president of Freeport. Reports came out showing how there is actually a conflict of interest of government officials who put pressure on the Congolese government to allow an American company to get access to this mine, showed what happened to the Congolese community, the Congolese people who live where the copper was. Nothing has ever happened up until today. The information is there. So I understood actually the negative press around these 6 mining companies from a larger scale of what the anti-Chinese sentiment hysteria that's happening on the African continent. That is not based on facts. That is not based on the reality of what's taking place. And when China takes action, of course, it's not mentioning in the press clearly what China is actually doing. But that's not really what should the discussion be, right? Even with the United States, their actions on the ground.
I was just going to say that's so interesting that you mentioned that the actual documentary you're saying came out of like an anti-China sentiment.
I mean, I don't know what the motive is for the filmmaker, but what I do know, at the present time on the African continent, there is a hysteria around what China is doing in Africa, and it's not based on facts. The documentary itself talks about ending slave trade. China is not doing slave trade in Congo. I mean, it's an insult to really what slave trade actually means. So filming a Chinese company doing mining that is illegal, where the Chinese government has taken action, does not translate to China enslaving Africans for extreme profit. Right?
And I do want to ask you, I do want to get into the issue of the kind of anti-China hysteria that is happening across the continent. But before we do get into that, because I think that this is tangentially related, and this is, I guess, really a question that can go towards both of you. But I think people might be surprised to learn that AFRICOM, which is the U.S. military's African command, which was set up in 2007, has not been able to find a home on the African continent. In fact, the headquarters are in Germany, so in Europe, which I just think is interesting. I don't think when people think of AFRICOM, they don't really understand what it is, but they assume it's at least in Africa. And part of the reason it's not in Africa is because of a pushback from African people to pressure their governments not to give into U.S. demands to shift their headquarters from Europe to Africa. But I guess I'm curious, can you tell our listeners and viewers, what is the role of AFRICOM on the African continent, and how much of it is a reaction to preventing China's relationship with African countries from, becoming, a bigger one, I guess. And I don't know, Mika, if maybe you want to take that first.
Sure, because I think Kambale can give a very specific example of the DRC where it's very recently been manifest. So I think it's important again. So as a researcher in Tricontinental, we produced a study in July that we collaborated on with SMG, the Socialist Movement of Ghana's Research Institute. And we conducted this research to understand the nature of foreign military presences on the continent. And what we found that now, under the banner of diplomacy, conflict resolution, security support, a core mandate actually of the US military apparatus on the continent, which of course is alongside their economic interests, is to thwart and push back against China's growing influence in Africa. Because, as I mentioned, Chinese private and public commercial interests have increased on the African continent, and they've consistently outbid many Western firms. I think it was in 2020, 60% of these kinds of infrastructural, tenders went to Chinese private and public commercial organizations. And you would think that this mandate of trying to push back against China would be, conducted secretly or, would be a little bit more hush-hush. But not only is it evident in terms of where foreign military presence is, particularly the US and France, and what kind of activities they conduct, but it's also been more evident in policy documentation. It's kind of stated outright. I mean, the US has a document called, from 2019, I just want to find it in my notes, is New Africa Strategy, where they explicitly characterize their military presence in terms of competition. And I just want to quote, they say, great power competitors, namely China and Russia, are rapidly expanding their financial and political influence across Africa. They are deliberately and aggressively targeting their investments in the region to gain a competitive advantage over the United States. And this kind of policy is also complemented by, this is, their general foreign diplomacy policy, but is complemented by their defense policy, where as far back as 2006 in the kind of defense review, I think it's called, the authors spoke about how China is this emerging power. It has great potential to compete against the US, which many of us peace-loving people are hoping for a multipolar world where we have people balancing out the US's historical in the last 60, 70 years hegemony across the globe. But in all of this policy documentation, in defense documentation, it points back to protecting the kind of flows of capital and of resource extraction. So what we began to see is that the quality of their activities on the African continent is primarily economic, and in the fact that it is primarily economic and protecting their interests, needs to protect it against any other threat, which has been China. So I think that is part of what we try to raise in the study and what we try to look at, because clearly, as we know, from this last week's developments with the AUKUS, the Australia, UK, US alignment, and them bringing these nuclear submarines closer and closer to China's borders, there is clearly a bigger thing at play, and we can't discount what's happening on the African continent, which is in many ways a big, a buffer zone between China and the US. And the US is clearly adamant to try to increase their defensive capacities, increase their counter offense against China. And ironically, I believe, they try to inflate China's military presence in Africa by throwing all these very factually incorrect things. I mean, General Lieutenant Townsend said a couple of months ago that China was trying to create a new military base on the west coast of Africa, which is factually incorrect. He had nothing to back it up over. Meanwhile, they've had a mobile, a mobile ship. What is it called? But basically, it's a ship that acts as a military base,
like an aircraft carrier,
Yes, aircraft carrier. But it's basically a naval base that has been moving. They performed a military activity earlier. If it wasn't this year, it was last year in North Africa, and they've been moving down the coast of Africa. No one is talking about that. They recently docked in Namibia. And this is a huge ship, like huge infrastructure, but nobody talks about that being like a mobile military base of the US. Meanwhile, they're trying to, drum up this hype around China playing some kind of a role, when in fact, China's rhetoric, if you look at the foreign ministry and all of that, they welcome multilateralism. They welcome engagement. They welcome trying to build a world where more equal partners are making decisions around these kinds of things. I mean, last thing I'll say is that earlier this year, Secretary or the State Department, head of the State Department, Anthony Blinken, yes.
Tony Blinken,
Tony Blinken, he had a call with like a kind of bilateral meeting with African states or African leaders, over Zoom, of course. But he basically cautioned African leaders, and there were a bunch of students as well, saying, be wary of China's presence, be wary of their predatory nature, in a way that kind of sounded like he was speaking about intel from 10 years ago. It was honestly like very outdated. But what is the response of the Chinese foreign ministry? They say, we welcome any aid, concrete material advances you can bring to the African continent. We welcome you. Versus the US's kind of caution, don't make relationships with China. So I think we also need to understand that their approach to foreign policy is ultimately qualitatively totally different and totally separate. And it's often difficult to, move through that and identify that because of the nature of the hegemonic Western media that tends to dominate the African continent, just even on a basis of sharing the language of English.
And it's incredible too, and this is what I'd love for you to speak to, Kambale, because like for everything you just explained, Mika, you compare that to what the US does. And the US is just such a destructive and destabilizing force. I mean, objectively speaking, on the ground, in reality. And that, whether we're talking about Libya's collapse, which destabilized the Sahel, which of course the US and France are using as a pretext to get more involved. And then of course the US appears to be using the presence of the ADF in the Congo as a pretext for intervention as well. And I, of course, accidentally called it the AFD when we were talking before recording, which was a little bit funny. But Kambale, can you speak to that? Can you speak to, compared to what Mika just described, where the Chinese are like building things and actually giving out loans that aren't predatory. Conversely, you do need this incessant propaganda, because what is the US doing? And can you give some examples?
First, speaking about China, China has a very long history with the African continent. It didn't start today, a decade ago, or for many decades. China has been a partner with the African people, not just for development, but also for our independence struggle. Right? We had young Africans who mobilized during the 60s to free themselves. And whenever you think about the young Africans who fought for independence and you read their writings, they were so inspired by the Chinese who in 1949 were able to transform their country. And they looked up to them and said, how were they able to take control of their country, their lands, their resources to transform? So the partnership that we've had, especially in the time of Mao, meeting with Kwame Nkrumah, providing support, intellectual support, material support to the independence struggles, the independence struggle leaders, is something that sometimes is not spoken about. We focus on development, but we've had this partnership with China for many decades. Specifically now in the DRC, the United States engagement always give the historical view. Now, I explained in the beginning how the US was the first country to recognize Congo as a personal property of King Leopold. Congo would not be what it is today with all the exploitation it had if it wasn't for the diplomatic support of the United States to King Leopold II. Also, they supported Belgium during colonialism, the extraction of mineral resources for World War I and World War II. I mentioned the uranium. The support of dictators after the 1960s. And now present day, in 1996, Congo was invaded by two of the United States allies, Rwanda and Uganda. Surprisingly, these two nations have been US allies on the war on terror. So for example, for those who have been following what's happening in Afghanistan, you've heard that Rwanda and Uganda are two countries who have offered for the United States to bring Afghans refugees. Not only that, some have discovered that for the so-called coalition of the willing, Ugandan soldiers are in Afghanistan. They actually do not want to leave Afghanistan. They want to stay in Afghanistan because they are paid lower salary than American soldiers, but in African money is actually a lot. And those are US taxpayers' money. So you have African soldiers waging US war abroad, and most people do not know. And now in this context of the conflict of the Congo, as I mentioned, that two of US allies, Rwanda and Uganda, invaded the Congo in 1996. They invaded the Congo in 1998 and have unleashed the death of over 6 million Congolese. These are Holocaust death toll numbers. And the world is silent. Resources of the Congo have been exploited by American corporations, no accountability. And lately with the ADF, the so-called jihadist as presented by the Pentagon and the State Department, where everyone in Congo knows that the ADF rebel group in the Congo is not a jihadist group. It's not tied to what the US want us to believe. The United States want the world to believe that a rebel group in DRC is tied to ISIS. So as the United States is leaving Afghanistan, that removing their troops, they are transferring these troops literally at the same time to the DRC to go over ISIS, to go in the Congo to go after ISIS in DRC. And the fundamental question of the ordinary Congolese who have been reading the news, who've been understanding what's happening in the globe, they are asking the question, if the United States was unable for 20 years to stop the Taliban, if they cannot stop the so-called ISIS, how come are they going to come in the heart of Africa with American soldiers and stop ISIS? So beyond the question, what are the facts? The United Group of Experts have published numerous reports in the past 2 years, clearly stating that there is no connection between the ADF rebel group and ISIS. So how are you going to tell me today that in the State Department, in the Pentagon, they have more intel than those who are on the ground, who have done the research, who are consistently publishing? And this reminds me of something that happened after 9/11. We had an American general, General Colin Powell, who went to the UN Security Council and looked at people straight in the eye without flinching and said that Saddam Hussein has weapons of mass destruction. And we know today this was a lie. That was an American general who actually did that. And now that they've done the lie in Iraq, they've done the lie in Afghanistan, they want us in the Congo to accept that there is a tie to ISIS in DRC. But it's not only happening in DRC, it's also happening in Mozambique. So why is the US military in DRC? Mika explained it well. AFRICOM, beyond what they will say to the world, we are clear on the African continent that they only have two missions. The first mission is to secure strategic interests of the United States on the African continent. What I mean about strategic interests is mineral resources, particularly the oil, the cobalt, the lithium, mineral resources that the United States want to control in the world and using the world as its dominion. And the second objective for AFRICOM is to counter China on the African continent. So when you start seeing these operations on the African continent, you are noticing very fast that wherever you see AFRICOM, you see China. And you can even superimpose it with the instabilities that we are seeing now. When you look at Central African Republic, when you look at Guinea, when you look at Mali, and I was point at Mali, and in Guinea particularly, the latest coup that happened in Guinea, which I hope people they were able to read the New York Times fantastic, bizarre article about the coup in Guinea, where the week of the coup, after September 5th, I think 3 days later, a video of US soldiers in Guinea was circulating all over social media. And everyone was asking, why are there American soldiers right in Guinea, in Conakry, in the middle of the coup, filming Guineans who were celebrating the coup? And the article says something fascinating. They were quoting the spokesperson of AFRICOM and other government officials. The New York Times says that the week before the coup, AFRICOM, in concert with the Pentagon, were able to send US Green Beret for a military training in Guinea. And these Green Beret were training, literally, the special force that did the coup. So on Sunday, September 5th, these Green Berets were surprised that their students decided to go to the palace and do the coup. As soon as they found out that they did the coup, they stopped the course and stopped the training. This was on the New York Times, in front of everyone to see. That how is it possible that AFRICOM sending its soldiers, right, American soldiers, these Green Beret, to train soldiers who just did the coup, and somehow they do not know? We want to know what type of training they were receiving, which chapter in that training said that you need to try out to see if the coup will work. I mean, there are so many things that we can say about what's so bizarre about it. But why am I pointing out Guinea? Because Guinea, particularly around China, is a country where China has had very recent deals, particularly for bauxite, which is turned into aluminum, and also for iron. And it's very important to put that in context. So it's not happening in silo, as Mika said. China used to get most of its iron from Australia. Australia is no longer selling its iron to China. China has better quality iron now from Guinea. And as they've solidified this deal, all of a sudden we have a coup backed by soldiers trained by the United States, where Green Beret arrived weeks before. So we're clear about why AFRICOM exists, the impact that it has had on the African continent, and we are very cautious around US militarism on the African continent. That's not what Africa needs. Africa needs development partners and partners who want Africa to rise, not those who want to create train soldiers who are committing coups and bring more militarism on the African continent.
So on the subject of, different countries, I also wanted to bring up the country you're in, actually, Kambale, right now, which is Ghana. But Mika, this question will actually be for you, and Kambale, you're welcome to add on to it. But in that Tricontinental report that you mentioned that you had worked on, and just for those who are watching and listening, the report you can find at the Tricontinental website. It's excellent. It's called "Defending Our Sovereignty: U.S. Military Bases in Africa and the Future of African Unity," and I will link to it in the description of this video. But in that report, it was detailed. The U.S. presence in Ghana was quite detailed, and it's pretty wild because Ghana is a place that we constantly hear in the Western press that's being devoured by China somehow, despite the fact that I think, if I'm not mistaken, something like 98% of Ghana's gold is in the hands of U.S. and Canadian multinational corporations. But I'm curious if you can talk about the difference in what the U.S. versus China are doing in Ghana and how it compares to what we hear about.
Sure. And Kambale, feel free to jump in since you're in the belly of the beast. I mean, so one of the things we try to raise in the dossier is around, and just using, again, Ghana as a case study that is happening across the continent, I would say, and it has been happening, is that we initially start off with, in 2019, the US Department of Defense basically proposed to Ghana to enter into a status of forces agreement, which basically was like a $20 million deal, and it would essentially allow the US military to expand their presence in Ghana. But what was so crazy is there was so much, counter response from Ghanaian people. People were pushing back. People were trying to hold the government of Ghana to account. And the government kept saying, well, no, this is just an agreement that will facilitate certain mobilities and things like that. But if you look closely at the agreement that they made, it's very clear that this is a form of expanding a US military base, even though it's maybe not in name by erecting the kind of infrastructure. But basically, it has allowed them to, the US military, that is, to operate and use one of the key airports, the Kotoka Airport, which is the main international airport. I was in Ghana a couple of months ago, and it was bizarre to see, US military envoys exiting that space. It has basically become, in the words of one of the US military generals, a bus route to West Africa. So moving, as you mentioned, AFRICOM does not have its headquarters in Africa yet, even though Buhari of Nigeria recently mentioned that the base should come to Africa because of all the conflicts, which is counter to sentiments he's held in the past, but this is a discussion for another day. But basically, this is now, they're in Accra. The airport is in Accra, which is the capital city of Ghana. There is now this presence of US military, and basically the agreement says that they can use all the facilities. It'll be designated for exclusive, US forces. The soldiers will have diplomatic immunity. They can do anything that they want whilst they're there and face no criminal consequences. They can carry guns whenever they want without being held into question. And so essentially, in this vague, legally terminology, the US is now operating that space as its base and is, as the lieutenant said, a bus route to the rest of West Africa. I mean, maybe Kambale can also chip in here, but this is, for me, in huge opposition to some of the major investments and projects that China has actually undertaken and completed. One of the examples I was thinking about earlier when I was preparing for this discussion was in west of Ghana. There is a gas plant in, I think it's Atuabo is the name of the, or Atuaba. I might be wrong on the pronunciation, but basically, I think it was perhaps, it must be a decade ago, but I can't actually recall the exact date. But China basically entered into an agreement where they built, through this model of infrastructure for resources, where they built the infrastructure for a gas plant in Ghana that would basically have the capacity for 150 million metric tons, I think is the word, or standard metric feet, something of that sort. But huge amounts
Yes.
of gas that will be extracted per day. And the construction of this gas plant was again undertaken by Sinopec, which is the big international petroleum state-owned company by China. And basically, when it was created, it made a huge difference to the daily lives of Ghanaians in the west and central provinces, because it was closing the gap between the supply and demand for electricity at much lower costs than previously. It, reduced the annual crude oil import. It created the opportunity for jobs. It enabled to create like the basic infrastructure for not only petroleum expertise, infrastructure, etc., but also petrochemicals, where they were also able to now produce liquefied petroleum gas, which can also be used for various electrical and energy generation needs. So, I mean, again, life is complicated. The presence of China is complicated, but this is one of the big, significant investments that materially changes the lives of African people versus the US trying to weigh in on their kind of contribution through military means and military presence.
I'm curious, like the US accuses China of building up its military capacity in Africa. And apart from the obvious hypocrisy there, especially given the US military presence you both have described in various countries, apart from that obvious hypocrisy, is there even like a kernel of truth? Like, does China have any military capability that it's building at all in Africa?
China has the military presence, but it's exaggerated. China has done, I'll speak about the DRC, they've done some military training for the Congolese army, even from the Zairian army in the past, in the 80s. A good example, I don't know if I should say good example of that, but the former president of DRC, Joseph Kabila, was trained in China. And it's also one of the reasons why during this regime also, there was some close ties with China in terms of development. And we had so many bilateral discussions around development. The Near for Resources deal that we've had with China came toward that time. But to say that China is actually building its military capacity on the African continent, I think is bogus. I mean, just today we are September 22nd, 2021. Just go on the Twitter page of the US Embassy in Kinshasa today. Just go to the page and see what's there. But before you do, I will tell you what's there. On September 22nd, 2021, on the US Embassy Twitter page, there is a picture of the Congolese president. On his right, there is the US ambassador and about 9 African soldiers around, and they're all posing for a picture. And the embassy says, and they are explaining in the tweet, what is the partnership of the United States and Congo. And they said that our partnership is to help the Congo combat rebels and militia groups such as ISIS. So while we are trying to find out if China is building its military capacity, the Twitter page of the United States government through its embassy has a picture of the soldiers posing for everybody to see, and no one is asking any question. So it's not what the issue is. We know that it's diverting the question. And I want to touch on the Ghana situation. It's really important because most people will not understand why there is a problem with even the US military engagement. We know that in Chicago, we have crisis. Now, that crisis is related to the conditions of the people there. But sometimes when we hear about Chicago, we hear about people being shot and killed and so on. So let's take Chicago as an example. Chicago has an airport, and that airport is Chicago O'Hare. Let's say that Ghana decides, because of the violence in Chicago, they will ask the government of Illinois or the United States government to give them a terminal in Chicago, like the Chicago O'Hare, that it gives you one terminal, to come and help American citizens to bring an end to the so-called violence in Chicago. That's what happened in Ghana, right? There is an international airport called Kotoka International Airport, which has 3 terminals: Terminal 1, Terminal 2, Terminal 3. Terminal 1, the entire terminal, has been given to the US military.
Jesus.
No Ghanaians work around there. It's given to the US military. The planes flying into Ghana doesn't go, whatever happens there doesn't go to Ghanaian customs. It's not controlled by the Ghanaian government. They have no idea what happens in that terminal. So when the soldiers come in, they can't even be inside of Accra. Nobody knows. They don't need visas. They use US military ID card to even be checked around. If they commit crimes in Ghana, they are not under the jurisdiction of the Ghanaian law. And it's the hub, because the United States is in partnership with France, with all these military operations happening in the Sahel region, where France is saying that they're going after the jihadists in the Sahel region. Well, we know it's not that, it's really around uranium. So that's the context of looking at what is AFRICOM doing. The United States military, with its cooperation in France, are protecting US and French interests in the West African region while countering China's presence on the African continent. So it's really important to really understand what is actually, what are they doing on the African continent? And the United States does not have any moral authority to talk about mining contract, exploitation, neocolonialism. We still have not even discussed reparation for slavery, right? We're discussing about China.
We're all laughing because it's like so absurd. Not because it's funny, but it's just like the idea of America giving reparations for anything.
And sorry, if I can add also a tiny one, just because I wanted to mention it before and I forgot, is, as Kambale mentioned, we are talking a lot about the US, but we can't negate the roles of countries like France, who he mentioned with uranium. We have a country like Niger. Just as a contrast, I want you to understand this. Niger has one of the biggest uranium deposits. How interesting is it that one of the biggest US foreign drone bases happens to be there? 1. 2, that France has a strong military presence adjacent to this big uranium deposit. And then finally, that I think it's 1 in 3 French light bulbs, the light bulbs in France, 1 in 3 of them gets energy from that uranium deposit in Niger, in Africa. And let us contrast the reality of the fact that, as far as I know, most of the French population has access to electricity. I think they have 100% electricity
24
access rate.
Last I was there, it was 24 hours a day, always coming out
all
of the
time.
Mm-hmm.
What is the access of the people of Niger? What is the access? It is less than, I think, 15% have access to the grid, let alone the guarantee of electricity. Those are the people of Niger. And I'm saying this because we've just seen in Afghanistan, they've left Afghanistan 20 years, over 2 trillion spent. Is it 2 trillion, right? 2.5?
I think it's an underestimate. I think it's closer to 6 trillion. But let's get to be generous. We can say 2 trillion. It's still an absurd amount of money. 2
trillion. Let's be generous. And how much of the population has access to electricity? It's less than a third. I think it's closer to a quarter of the population. So in Niger, you have 80+% of the population don't have access to electricity. We've seen what has happened in Afghanistan. Most of the population doesn't have access to electricity. Yet we still don't want to talk about the fact that the US, French, and foreign military armies are essentially protecting their access to these resources at the detriment of the African continent, who, again, by the way, over 500 million, and we have a population of 1.2, right?
1.34 billion, I think I saw
billion.
from your Tricontinental report. Yeah.
Yes, 1.3 billion on the population. 500 million do not have access on the African continent. So
That's
again, just for
crazy.
context, just for understanding, because otherwise we can't understand the role of the US military, the role of all these, tweets about these strongmen. It's absurd. And again, the presence is, as Kambale said, the Chinese presence or military presence is negligible compared to the US. Because again, if we look at the US military budget, I think the 2020 budget for the US military was it 700 to 900 billion, whatever it was.
Yeah,
but
somewhere around that. Yeah, 700 something billion, also probably an underestimate. But yeah, officially it's like almost $800 billion a year.
And that amount is equivalent to the next 11 countries' budgets.
Mm-hmm.
So whatever the next 11 countries that follow, their budgets are equivalent to the US military, where China's, who's second, only takes up a third of that budget. And so the one base that they do have is in Djibouti. They do have it. But that came in 2008. And they joined an anti-piracy maneuver that essentially was mandated by the UN Security Council. So they joined this based on a resolution created by the UN to, reduce kind of piracy movements in the Horn of Africa. And in fact, another aspect that I think really needs to be understood is in the Horn of Africa, super militarized, a lot of different conflicts. What does the Chinese government do? Do they say, let's expand and build a base in Ethiopia? No. They say, let us finance the construction of an electrical railway. That's around 4 billion, of a water pipeline, and support various forms of infrastructure that would better advance the development of African people. So I just think we need to have that in mind when we're thinking about the contrast of the types of military presence and general foreign policy approaches, because ultimately China's is qualitatively different. Their approach to peace is about infrastructure, not armament.
I mean, I think it goes back to the issue of imperialism too, right? Because I mean, Europe and the US are literally sustained, their lifestyles are sustained by the mass impoverishment and basically theft of resources of the global South. And that is not at all the relationship that China or the Chinese have to the global South. They're a part of the global South. So I think that's a really important thing you just laid out. I did want to ask you guys, because this goes back to something that Kambale had sort of, both of you have actually kind of mentioned throughout this conversation or alluded to at least, and that is the issue of the propaganda on the African continent. And I mean, a lot of this is openly tied to hitting back and challenging the Belt and Road Initiative, which is a huge threat to U.S. strategic interests, as they call it. And so, you have just for those who are watching and listening, I'm sure you two already know this, but U.S. Congress has allocated hundreds of millions of dollars for the purposes of propaganda against the Belt and Road Initiative. And this has been quite successful in the West, obviously. Where I've even heard European diplomats who are otherwise, very smart people and somewhat progressive. I'm not going to name any names, but I've heard certain people that I've spoken to repeat these propaganda lies about China and Sri Lanka, just because they're reading it constantly in their own newspapers. But I can also say, like in the Middle East where I live, this propaganda hasn't, I don't think at least, been quite as effective. Countries in the Middle East, whether they're allied with the US or not, are happy to do business with China, like whether it's Saudi Arabia or the United Arab Emirates. And particularly, of course, those that are impacted directly or indirectly by US sanctions. But so I'm curious what impact this level of propaganda is having on the African continent. And I'm sure it's different across different African countries. Obviously, it's not, all one place where everybody digests the same news or even speak the same language. But maybe Kambale, you could start by speaking to this. How has this sort of Western-backed propaganda sparked anti-China sentiment in a place like the DRC, for example? And I just mean among the average population, not necessarily among government officials.
No, I think it's both ways. The propaganda exists, but there are some facts on the ground that allows also the propaganda to be pushed. And I'm saying that from the perspective of the Alain Foucault, right? So it's easy to get a video of one individual Chinese who's done inaction against the locals, and then generalize the situation and say, oh, the Chinese state is doing A, B, C, D. And then it doesn't help. Now when you start getting the propaganda from the West about what China is doing, look at the video that circulated. I mean, those videos are real of an abuse that took place somewhere of a Chinese worker with a local, but then it's extrapolated out of context. Now, the propaganda itself has the wrong premise. Let's look at the Belt and Road Initiative. Let's say it doesn't exist. Africa today has mineral resources. Africa is cash-strapped. Right? Africa needs development. The United States, Western powers, have demonstrated for 400 years the unwillingness to develop Africa, or to be fair partners with Africa, to build the infrastructure that Africa needs. So who will build the infrastructure of Africa without capital? China in the early 2000s understood it because they went through a process, right? The process that they went through allowed them to understand why it's important to exchange what you have and what they themselves can give. And in the case of DRC, that says, you have copper, you have cobalt, we need it. You need schools, you need hospitals, you need roads. We can provide that. Rather than you spending money to be able to pay for that, because we know you are cash-strapped, you owe the World Bank billions of dollars. At the time it was about $14 billion that the Congo owed the World Bank. We will take amounts of copper and cobalt, and we will build this infrastructure for you. So that's the $9 billion deal that China had. $3 billion, a joint project between the DRC and China. And the $6 billion is the infrastructure project. And the $3 billion earmarked of the joint project will pay for the debt. So at the end of the process, Congo is debt-free. That's a perfect deal for the Congo. I mean, we can look at the deal clearly and see what are the clauses, what is good, what is bad, what can be transformed. The deal is there, so people can look at it. But this is stopped by the World Bank and the IMF, where in 2008 and 9, they start telling the Congo that they need to renegotiate the Chinese contract. So what they did by forcing the Congo to say, before we forgive your $14 billion debt that comes from the Mobutu era of a dictator that we, the United States back, installed for 32 years, and had these loans that accrue in interest, ended up with Congo owing $14 billion, where we can show what actually the $14 billion bill. They said, before we forgive this debt, you need to renegotiate the Chinese contract. And they forced the Congolese government to remove the state guarantee of the $3 billion project and made Congo $6 billion in debt. So in 2021, we'll discuss that Congo has a $6 billion debt from the DRC, which was forced by the World Bank. So we understand what the propaganda is doing. The propaganda is allowing, is pushing for Africans to not look at the fact, to not actually look at what is happening, and actually make decisions that's against their own interest. Because the United States is not going to build the roads in the Congo. They're not interested in that. They're interested in profit. The United States is not going to help the DRC. They have 100 years experience, right? We have a 100-year historical record of the United States engagement in the DRC. Now that China is ready to build infrastructure and they're able to do it, and that's actually what's happening on social media right now. This past month of September has been fascinating to see the Chinese ambassador, the foreign minister of China, actually posting on social media the accomplishment of China in the DRC. The Busanga Dam, the cultural center they're building, speaking about how they've paid billions of dollars of taxes. They actually show the record of how much taxes they've paid to the DRC government. So they are listing the concrete project and what they've done in DRC. And as I mentioned earlier, September 22nd, 2021, the US Embassy has the opportunity to show what the United States is doing in DRC. They put a selfie picture of the United States ambassador, the Congolese president, surrounded by US military. So we understand what the propaganda is doing, pushing Africans to make decisions against their interests. We also know what China has done for the African continent and doing. And it's important to combat this myth of China as a colonial power, an exploitative power, when they're coming to the table and say, let's discuss and let's build this new world.
Mika, given all that, which, by the way, I just want to point out, you reminded me of the fact, because you were talking about the U.S. basically preventing a Chinese project that could have actually helped people. I'm in Lebanon right now, where anybody who watches my show regularly sees my electricity go out every other episode. It's kind of become a regular thing that happens. And Lebanon, as anybody's been reading the news about Lebanon, anybody knows that Lebanon is experiencing these horrible 21-hour blackouts every day due to this fuel crisis. China actually last year wanted to invest in Lebanese infrastructure, which would have been very beneficial for the country. It needs power stations. It needs to rebuild its port after the explosion last year. And the U.S. government literally threatened Lebanon, do that and we will sanction you. They also threaten Lebanon, accept Iranian fuel and we will sanction you. But the point is they are going around using their power, the power of the dollar, to shut down desperate countries with very little infrastructure, thanks to imperialism from countries like the US, from having a country like China come and actually build it. And it's just so infuriating to hear story after story like that. And so I know I've had you guys for a very long time, and I promise we can wrap. I just have two more questions I want to ask you. And the first one, I guess this can be for you, Mika, is you mentioned this a bit earlier, but everybody in the U.S., a part of this propaganda about China being a rising power is this threat of having a multipolar world. The U.S. wants it to stay unipolar. It wants to stay the global hegemon. And so my question for you is a multipolar world better for the African continent, I guess the global South in general, given the devastation wrought by neoliberalism, by U.S. imperialism over the last several decades?
I mean, the simple answer is yes. A multipolar world would be better for Africa, simply because on a basic level, and in fact, we're going to have an important discussion on Saturday as part of the No Cold War.
This will probably come out. This might come out after that. So let's say this. Everybody should tune in on Saturday. Part of, where can they find it? If this comes out before, where should they tune in?
No Cold War YouTube channel.
And if it's past, you should go back and watch it. Also on the No Cold War YouTube channel. That way it works either way, but go ahead.
Sure. So, I mean, a multipolar world is in the interest of humanity, because at this stage, for the last, 60, 70 years, we've seen how the US unilaterally makes these decisions in its own interest, and not in its own interest, even its own people. I mean, both of you have been to the US and lived there, I think, in different stages of your lives. You've seen the huge inequality that is in the US doesn't even benefit the average person. There are huge amounts of poverty that is only now becoming more apparent to the rest of the global South in the moments of COVID, and the huge amounts of deaths. Isn't it? It's now 670 plus thousand people have died from COVID. The same amount of people who died in the Spanish flu, as far as I understand, the total is the US exceeds it. So right now, the rest of the world, particularly the global South, who in many ways have been dominated by US Western media, US cultural values, individualism, consumerism, all those things, are now, I think, really coming to a point in which we see that the values and the practices of a unipolar US-led world are simply not in the interest of humanity. And in fact, this challenge that China has been able to present has shown us alternatives that we didn't actually think were possible. We didn't think we could connect countries. And, as Kambale said, the history is often hidden of China's cooperation role on the African continent. I mean, when in the early 70s, they were building the Tanzania-Zambia railway line, it was extremely important because, as I mentioned earlier, any railway station or railway lines that were built under colonialism were just taking raw materials to the oceans to ship them away. Whilst China in the early 70s was producing a railway line that would connect African countries, two countries that, Zambia is a landlocked country and struggles to get trade to via the kind of ocean ports. And so historically, China's played a very different role that has shown us what it means to collaborate for development, what it means to act, as Xi Jinping, the president of China, said, for a common prosperity. And I think that common prosperity now more than ever is so important because we are faced with environmental crises, with, global recessions, social ruin, essentially. And our sustainability as a planet hinges on a kind of common prosperity that I think China presents, and many actors supporting and advancing because of China's development show us, rather than the, winner takes all, it's every man for himself version of the world that the US is presenting that simply is not, on a basic ecological level, sustainable. It's simply not.
And I think that really plays out in the way that each of these countries has responded to the world over COVID, over the pandemic. On the one hand, you have the US literally denying entire areas of the world access to these vaccines simply by refusing to push its pharmaceutical companies to waive their vaccine patents. So I think the continent of Africa, like 2% of people have even been vaccinated, which is outrageous. Well, also, the US was hoarding PPE, and just you had the exact opposite reaction from China. China has been sending its vaccines abroad. It was sending protective equipment abroad. And then, of course, you see this in the way that China itself has handled the virus versus the US, kind of going back to the point you were making about how US people don't actually benefit from any of this, actually. But I guess my final question would just be, like, how has the US versus Chinese response to COVID to other parts of the world had an impact on the way that people view these two countries? Has this maybe accelerated the decline of America, of American empire in people's minds?
China did not leave the African continent during COVID. And I mean, this was very visible even during the lockdown period in March of 2020. Being in Ghana and seeing what unfolded, many US NGOs and people who work for American companies, they got their flights back to the United States. But Chinese didn't leave. I mean, you can look at many of the African countries. Chinese did not leave the African continent during COVID. They actually stayed. They continued. When you look at the projects that the Chinese foreign minister posted about the big cultural center that's being built in Kinshasa, that's going to be the biggest cultural center on the African continent when it's finished. And he pointed it out that in the middle of COVID, we continue construction. Right? So they stayed with the African people in the process. And that's been the history of Africa. That's what I pointed out earlier, how during the liberation struggle, Chinese were with us. And in the crisis of COVID, Chinese were still with us in the process. So, but while I'm saying this, we also need to remind ourselves there is a anti-Chinese hysteria that's taking place at the same moment. So people are falling in the two categories. While they understand that China is a trading partner, some are falling for the propaganda. But I think in the final analysis, it's going to be very clear to the African continent when we talk about concrete projects. Who is doing what, right? How is that impacting the people? The way even engaging with the ordinary African in the streets, I say, why is it so bad to trade with the country that actually manufacture the United States flag?
That's a good point.
So if China can manufacture the US flag, I say, made in China, why can't they manufacture our products? Why can't they trade with us? So whenever people now hear this very simplistic explanation, they want to know more. So what is China doing? Right? And you can lay out the facts. And for DRC, I'm very concerned about what China has done. Before even the war in DRC, they built Stade Camagnola. They have the engineers who have worked closely with us to build bridges between Congo, Kinshasa, and Congo Brazzaville. At the present time, the Busanga Dam, the hydroelectric dam that they are building, when they finish this dam, it will provide Congo the 10% capacity to electricity from all the other grid that exists in the country. And they have more and more projects they are going to work on. Then when I look at the United States, what do I always say? Oh, this is the country that supported the invasions of the Congo. And one of the wonderful things, I actually mentioned it a few weeks ago. When I speak about China, I know what China has done. When I have to speak about US accomplishment in the DRC, I always ask people, please talk to Juliana Lumumba. And she'll talk about her father, who was assassinated by the CIA, chopped off into pieces, put into acid so that his body cannot be found anywhere till today. Even though they killed him in this brutality, this ideas of Lumumba continue. And that's the struggle for the Congolese. We know we have our land. We know we have our resources. We want partners, trading partners who respect the Congolese, who want to work with the Congolese. Whenever you go to them and raise an issue with them, such as the Congolese government has done, that we have 6 Chinese mining companies illegally exploiting the Congolese, you do something about it, which they did very swiftly, and not as the United States with the dozens of companies where the names are known, the OECD complaints exist, the UN reports exist. So this is what these companies are doing ABCD in DRC. You should hold them accountable for pilfering the resources, supporting a rebel group, illegally mining. No action still today. So it's a tough moment to be on the African continent, but it's a wonderful moment as we are determining how trade will be done on the African continent for the betterment of the African people.
Well, I think this conversation has been incredible.
Can I add one thing?
Yeah, of course. I was going to ask if you wanted to. Go ahead, please.
No, I just wanted to echo, because there are 2 things that Kambale mentioned that also I want to raise, is that, as Kambale said, during this moment of the COVID pandemic, there are 2 things I think we also need to understand. Is one, as he said, China never left the African continent. I think with the BRI, Belt and Road Initiative project, at least 1,000 projects continued. Building kept happening, even in this moment of crisis, with all the precautions, right? Because they have the infrastructure to produce those precautions. But then on the other hand is that they continue to, remain in Africa in the same year that they've accomplished removing or alleviating over 800 million people out of extreme poverty. I mean, this is not talked about enough. The African continent knows extreme poverty. We know colonialism. China has experienced extreme poverty. They know colonialism. They know the humiliation that comes from foreign domination based on the 1800s, right? And they were able, in the space of 70 years, to uplift the population, the biggest population in one country, in a relatively short amount of time, right? So I think we need to remember that. And when you're saying, Kambale, about how China didn't leave us in our time of crisis, it reminded me of in 1963 December, 1964 January, Premier Zhou Enlai, the premier of China at the time, he visited Africa for the first time. He went on this amazing tour. And during that time, a coup attempt was made against Kwame Nkrumah, the then president of Ghana. And in that moment, the Ghanaians are calling the Chinese saying, we understand if you guys can't come, we get it, it's fine. Actually, when Nehru from India tried to visit us, there was also a coup attempt and he decided to cancel. And Zhou Enlai sits back and says, no, we know your experience. We know the challenges of trying to build a humanizing alternative project. We are coming to visit you. Let's remove some of the security concerns. Let's remove some of the, the pomp of diplomatic visits. But let us meet and let us talk, because the interests of Ghana are the interests of China. And that was what I've been thinking about the last, 2 years of the COVID pandemic, and how China has not, in fact, left us in this moment of need. And just added to that is, I think we really do have to keep in mind also the fact that a lot of the anti-China hysteria is consistently drummed up by African elites and African leaders. In Zambia, when the opposition, Michael Sata, was running for the presidency in 2006, all he could say against the then ruling party was they're in cahoots with China. China's the reason why we have so many, sovereign debt, etc. And this is consistently used across the continent, in South Africa, and in any kind of, major corrupt country in Africa. China is scapegoated as a reason for the nation's problems. And it completely undermines the existence of our history of colonialism, our history of slavery, our history of neo and present history of neocolonialism, and the fact that the people who own and control the resources are not in fact dominated by the Chinese, but historically lie and continue to remain in the hands of European, corporate elites. So I think that that's also important, is that the use of hysteria amongst the general population is always incited for specific personal interests of the ruling elite in the African continent. And that's why it's so important that we in Africa understand that China is here, they're presenting us with opportunities. What we can do in our countries is to build strong organizational structures that will enable us to actually influence those decision-making processes and spaces that would actually benefit the advancement of the human development on the continent.
That's absolutely correct. I'm glad you mentioned that. Did you want to add something, Kambale?
No, I love
Okay. On that note, I think that's a great, I think that's an excellent place to wrap. I want to thank both of you for joining me and helping me break down what is I think, one of the most important topics that particularly people on the Western left should be paying attention to. And that is the constant demonization of China in these developing countries that really are benefiting or can benefit a lot from this sort of infrastructure development, on top of really understanding what it is the U.S. is doing. Because as Americans, I mean, that is what we should be most concerned about. But so to both of you, thank you so much, Kambale, Mika. I really appreciate you guys coming on.
Thank you so much
Thank
for having
you.
us.